afternoon and welcome to our session on protection of religious cultural heritage. I'm Peter Petkoff, I'm the editor of the Oxford Journal of Law and Religion, and for all my sins I write on legal protection of religious sites, but also religious cultural heritage. And for the past few months we have done a rather interesting journey which culminates with this panel. And this has involved looking into innovative ways of imagining what may we consider to be a religious cultural heritage and what are the new innovative ways we could deploy to protect it. When this conversation started, we were asked to look into protection of religious sites during armed conflict. And both me and my colleagues were rather reluctant to take on this task because we felt that policymakers should be more ambitious. They should really think about how to protect religious cultural heritage before the fighting starts, linking it with combating hate speech, racism, engaging with the questions of colonial past and colonial legacies, with the legacies of past and current empires, but also related to questions of sustainable development, questions of how we build inclusive, dialogical civic spaces, how do we read and interpret religion and culture as signs of early warnings that a conflict may emerge in the future, and broadly speaking, how religious cultural heritage could become the macrocosm of challenges and opportunities associated with the interplay between religion and society, religion and policy, and religion and foreign policy. And today with us we have an incredible panel of scholars, policymakers, who in their different capacities have looked into those questions. Some of them had traveled very personal journeys in dealing with protection of cultural heritage. Others have engaged with this on the arena of international politics and international organizations. We have an Under-Secretary General of the UN with us, we have a UNESCO chair, and we have scholars who have left a very significant footprint in this area. And this will be a panel which I will lead in a conversational fashion, and we're just going to brainstorm various ideas and various questions which have arisen during a fairly extensive period in which we have spoken, discussed, and imagined how to approach this topic. And let me start with a silly question, with a Monty Python question. Blen, yes? What has religious cultural heritage done to us? Why do we need to care about protection of religious cultural heritage?
Well, that's a fairly easy question. Religious cultural heritage is an embodiment of not only the religious values of a community, but also the architectural history, the cultural, the material culture. I mean, it embodies so much the values of a community, the religious values, and it's also, in some cases, can be used as a public space. It can be used for weddings, celebration of holidays. I mean, it has a lot of value. So specifically speaking about Ethiopia, for instance, which is a country that is experiencing a bit of conflict at the moment, it has also shown that in areas where there are a lot of ethnic tensions, these religious cultural heritage sites are still protected. People do not destroy them, they take care of them, despite the quite hateful speech that's going on between two ethnicities. So it is a really powerful thing. The value goes beyond ethnicity, which is something as a country now, we're immensely struggling with. So it's a powerful thing.
And obviously you've done incredibly important work on the Lalibela churches in Ethiopia, and you have seen them as cultural heritage sites beyond the narrow confines of cultural heritage. There are obviously a lot of issues which undercut the protection, which involve sustainable development, local economics, local sustainability. I mean, how do those emerging trends fare, you know, looking into Ethiopia, and how do they translate in the region from your perspective?
So from an economic perspective, in terms of development, there has been a lot of investment in trying to, Lalibela particularly, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's been inscribed in the UNESCO World Heritage List since 1978. It's a 800-year-old rock-hewn churches. So the area, northern Ethiopia is also known to experience famine and drought every once in a while. So there is a lot of dependency on tourism, which is something which needs to be done over in a sustainable way, so that people can truly be reliant on this as a source of revenue. But at the same time, we've seen through COVID and again conflict, which can suddenly appear, that tourism might not necessarily be dependable and reliable means. So there are other ways to engage the community through, it's a place of learning as well. It's a living heritage site. There are still deacons being brought up there. There are other intangible heritage values that can be taught, can be celebrated. It can be a center of knowledge about Ethiopian Orthodox Church. There can be a relation with the Coptic Church in Egypt. So there is lots of room to build relations, to show the value so it can be a source of education as well, and that can be another stream to develop the sites, to develop the area in a more sustainable way, perhaps.
And one of the most fascinating parts of our conversation has been that when we agreed to refer to the objects of our inquiry as religious cultural heritage, was partly with a caveat that religious cultural heritage doesn't exist as a technical, legal, or policy term, but what we tried to bring together was this relationship between sites, which are cultural sites, but they also have living communities, they're working sites from religious perspectives, and they create different dynamics, perhaps, from the dynamics cultural sites in the narrow sense represents. They're not just museums, they're not just places which tourists could attend to, but they represent dynamics where the stakeholders and the living and working religious communities also add to it. And this has brought into the conversation this complex relationship between tangible and intangible cultural heritage, and particularly cultural heritage of religious use and religious significance, something our existing policy tools and mechanisms have not been very good in relating to. And Alberto Meloni and I have had those conversations for a very long time, trying to see what is missing, what's already there, and what more we could do about highlighting more clearly this relationship between religious sites, places, and the processes, spiritual patterns, people living and sharing their experiences, completing their journeys to those religious sites, and how the two could be connected in the more integrated way. So the processes, the movements, the memories, and the ideas which travel to and from those sites, and sometimes even stay there, could be seen as a much more complex and much more dynamic whole. And Alberto, you have looked into those questions through various different routes, and we had various conversations about that. So how would you identify the challenges and the opportunities in that respect?
Well, thank you. What I think is that about the issue of religious heritage, there are a certain number of ambiguities that we have to keep alive in our conscience, because the topic is not at all a neutral topic or just a topic concerning the respect and the guilty complex that we feel when a relic of the past is destroyed. There is a religious heritage that we have to protect, first of all, that is peace. because we have to say that what put in danger religious cultural heritage many times and in all the circumstances is war, and this is an expression of a Catholic theologian, the superstition of war. Because the only thing that we know about war is that not a single problem is solved through the war. And so this means that war is a superstition, but a superstition to which we pay a great amount of worship and energy in different circumstances, even today. And in the context of war, the religious cultural heritage has a meaning that is a memory of peace and the promise of peace. It is something that says that peace can be rebuilt, forgiveness can start, and that there is a chance to live together into the difference. This, from my point of view, is important because in the very word heritage, for us who speaks late in at lunch, recalls something dangerous, the idea that there is somebody who died and we inherited an heritage. But in many circumstances, and thanks God, what we call religious heritage is the patrimony of people living, of communities that are active. And in this sense, for me, the distinction between tangible and intangible is useful, as many of the mechanisms that we use to define things. But there is something more that we have to say. In the religious cultural heritage, there is something tangible, something intangible, and there is, first of all and mostly, a meaning. And what we have to protect is not only the relic to preserve them, but also the meaning. And the meaning is the fact that the survival and the preservation of this heritage is a challenge against the war and against destruction. I'm looking, I must confess, a little dreams that I have in my mind since a few years. I'm looking for a skyscraper on which we can project with the video mapping the Bamiyan Buddhas, just to tell to our brother in Afghanistan that you can destroy the object, but you cannot destroy the meaning if somebody remembers the meaning. And this brings us to consider the tangible, the intangible, and the meaning of the tangible and the intangible in a broader way. There is a story, I will tell you 1 minute on that I want to tell you. I had the fortune for preparing the critical edition of the Council of the Syriac Church to discover in northern Iraq that the famous Baghdad 509 is famous for me and two of my friends. That is the only surviving manuscript of the conciliar liturgical and canonical tradition of the Syriac Church, was not destroyed, as it was said many times, but it was preserved. And along with it, they were preserved the entire library of the monastery of Al-Kosh. And in order to protect the manuscript, there were an awful lot of dangerous guys going in North Iraq saying, we will protect your manuscript. We take a picture, we take a digital copy, and we take it to Princeton or to Oxford. And so if you wanted to study this materials, if you want to understand what is the story, the life, and the doctrines of this church, you have to go to Princeton or to Oxford. This is not a way to protect. This is a way to take the meaning away from the object, to bring the meaning elsewhere, and what remains on site is simply a piece of paper with very awkward signs. And this, from my point of view, is something that we have to take very carefully into consideration, because the life of the community in danger can be preserved if there is knowledge and love for what they represent.
And this raises a whole set of questions which have been emerging in a British context in terms of questions about repatriation of Ethiopian tablets back to living religious communities vis-a-vis other forms of cultural artifacts which may be kept in museums, but they are not necessarily associated with living religious cultures. And this has raised a whole new conversation about how do we consider and imagine those objects and what is their life and how it is associating with living worshipful communities. And the relationship between tangible and intangible religious cultural heritage emerges in a different context in the living experiences of Tasula Haji Tofi. Tasula, your engagement with protection of religious cultural heritage is a personal journey. It's not just a journey of an expert. You are an expert. You have done more than any of us have done in tracking down trafficked Byzantine art, looted and sold on the black market, usually from churches which were based in northern Cyprus. But you didn't accidentally become who you are. Tasula, by the way, has a rather terrifying title of an icon hunter, but there is a story behind it. And you could tell us more about this. How your personal journey led you to rescue Byzantine art from Cyprus put on the black market.
Thank you, Peter, for that. So, first of all, I would like to say that I feel that I am speaking today on behalf of every person in an affected community of war and conflict who has suffered discrimination for their faith or their ethnic background. They have suffered sorrow and fear, and they have been deprived from their collective memories and their right to religious freedoms. So I just want to share something with you. Imagine that you are a 14-year-old girl in the Republic of Cyprus, which is the island of love and beauty. And imagine that you go to bed dreaming of your future, and you wake up in something you don't understand, in the midst of war and conflict, and being bombed by napalm bombs in 1974, and you feel unprotected. Imagine that nobody comes to your rescue, and you see and smell death and fear, rape of children and women, which you do not understand. So that picture is the fear which I deleted from my memory. But at the same time, there was another picture, and that was of my beloved mother that is still alive today, kneeling in the house in front of the icon of Apostolos Andreas, Saint Andreas, holding the candle of the last Easter we spent in Cyprus and praying for our freedom and for our safety. That picture marked my life. And that 14-year-old girl is me. I'm 63 today, and I have become critical. I'm sorry, because there are a lot of policymakers here, but I wonder I became critical of policymakers, international institutions, and legislation, because I felt so much alone as a child, abandoned, and there was no justice for us, and there was until today not, because Cyprus is occupied. So I spent the rest of my life going around the world, tracking down these icons, frescoes, and mosaics, which for the Orthodox Christians are part of our prayer. And I've been chasing the world to fight undercover with police and crooks to bring back these antiquities, as they call them, which are part of my prayer, to bring them back to the mothers, the fathers, sisters and brothers to pray to for our freedom. That is what this means. So if you destroy religious cultural heritage, especially for the Christian Orthodox, whereby we use imagery as a way to pray, to exercise our religious freedom, you actually prevent us from practicing our religious freedoms. And if you destroy the cultural heritage of a community, you destroy their souls, because these are the areas of collective memories. And the enemies know that. This is why for centuries, when there's a war or armed conflict, they destroy cultural and religious heritage so that they can rewrite history.
And one of the most fascinating things which I learned when I became familiar with your work is this symbolic journey back home. That the return of the stolen artifacts, in a way, is also symbolic plea for the right to return of Cypriot refugees. And it has intertwined and interconnected some of the conversations we had about religious cultural heritage in terms of material culture, and linking it with refugees, with migration, and right to return, right to pray and attend cemeteries and places of worship of your ancestors, which continues to be a challenge for freedom of religion and freedom of worship, from Nagorno-Karabakh through Cyprus, all the way to India and Pakistan. But it's also raising a whole question of opportunities. We no longer see religious sites and culture as something which is simply elitist, and it's important for a very small group of people who are cultural aficionados. They have become a very important way of understanding societies. And there is now consensus that the war in Ukraine has been the latest warning sign that unless we take culture, material culture, as well as moving and more fluid forms of culture in terms of ideas, identities, more seriously, we would not be able to respond to the weaponization of religious culture, which we see left, right, and center, in order to really support and amplify the resurgence of authoritarian regimes. And Kodaram, you have probably done more than any of us in terms of drafting religious association laws in the post-communist bloc. You have drafted the constitutions of New Iraq and Afghanistan, and your encounter with religious cultural heritage is fairly new, but it also resonates your scholarly commitment and your own faith commitment to the question, why are places of worship so important? So what do you consider to be challenges as well as opportunities in this conversation? What are the new trajectories we should consider in terms of finding new and more inventive ways, innovative ways in terms of approaching cultural heritage? And are there blind spots we're forgetting in this conversation?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Peter. I mean, there are several things that come to mind. I thought one thing is just the personal experience, also linked to Cyprus, but a different experience of seeing these cultural objects being destroyed, sensing what it meant to another religious tradition, and thinking about what attacks on sacred sites in my own tradition mean, which are often much younger, and the attacks may take the form of making it difficult to establish the places in the first place. So it's a different perspective, but it also helps us resonate with fundamental linkage between cultural heritage, religious heritage, and religious freedom. It takes different forms for different traditions, but in the end, that's one of the major areas. I think one of the interesting things to me is coming at this from the perspective of the G20 Interfaith Organization, which has worked to try and work within the G20 process to draw attention to these kinds of issues. And as I've been thinking about this the last few days, one of the things I realize is that some of the things that have happened are less obvious. Like, people think of the G20 of making some recommendations that will go into a communique that will be issued by these 20, well, it's 19 plus the EU countries. And obviously one wants to attract the attention of people to those issues. But in some ways, what's been interesting is to see how having a working group, which has been headed by Peter, has reached out and started helping to identify things. We had a wonderful relationship with the Alliance of Civilizations, headed by Moratinos, and working with that organization, which has the primary international responsibility for working on protecting sacred sites. But it's been interesting through our work with the G20, we've been able to interact with the staff to broaden perspectives, to think beyond physical objects to the intangible. I think to recognize that we need to be addressing religious heritage, that it's not just physical things, but the communities that we need to protect. And it's been interesting the way that, well, working on that in an institutional context, it provides an opportunity for linking some of the people who are here, some others that we've met with along the way, to broaden perspectives on why religious heritage is important, and to figure out important ways to operationalize it. I was sort of impressed yesterday when Knox Thames was talking in another similar session about how, as someone working for the State Department in the United States on issues solving Middle East peace problems, they'd realized that in many ways approaching things through the perspective of taking into account religious heritage opens up doors that would not otherwise normally be ways that one could talk about things. I think another kind of issue that the linkage with freedom of religion or belief highlights is the fact that it's more than just culture, it's worship. I like the image of, it's not just the buildings, it's the icons. It's the part of things that are really core to religion and religious worship and religious being. And I think approaching things from this area helps sensitize us to what I call, what many of us call, the contrast between the museum value of some of these sites and the worship value. And I think those sometimes come into conflict if we just think about it as an abstract culture issue, and if we think more directly about what this really means to people.
Yeah, and indeed, in a lot of the current discussions which have challenged our original imaginations of what's the purpose of cultural heritage, there is a big challenge of the raison d'etre of having museums, having the things which are in those museums, and why are they there, what do they represent, and to what extent we could unpack the idea of museums being essentially monuments of the consolidation of modern empires, and what do we do about this. But this doesn't mean to say that in these conversations we want to dismantle our cultural institutions, but we think that the conversation, a serious conversation about what culture is very important, and more importantly, an intergenerational conversation of how culture is important and why. And a lot of that comes into Maris Tadros's work. Maris has done very important work through the Crete project and the British Council project, looking into cultural heritage, trying to capture Coptic, but not only Coptic cultural heritage in the MENA region, and how this is part of a bigger conversation. This is not a conversation of empirical scientists, anthropologists going out and spending a lot of a very large governmental budget in doing a folklore collection, but it's about making the next generation essentially part of the solution, that they are empowered to receive the cultural heritage within which they're born and to understand why this is so important. Maris, you've obviously had several currents of your project which are very ambitious. You did the Coptic side, but you've worked on Yazidi cultural heritage, you've worked with people in Iraq, and obviously you've learned a lot about capturing intangible cultural heritage. But how did the intergenerational challenge was resolved in your project, or was it resolved? Did it remain unresolved?
Thank you, Peter. Well, as everyone knows, as long as we're living, nothing is ever resolved. There's always a process of continuous learning. And unlike everyone who's on this panel, I'm not an expert. I came to this area, I stumbled upon it. I work from a development background. So my entire academic work and practice has always been in the area of youth empowerment, women's empowerment, how do we bring about change in our communities. And during this work, I discovered that there's something fundamentally problematic about development when it completely ignores the meaning of memory, the meaning of festivals, the meanings of food, and dare I say it, joy. We act as if development is just about material things, but joy is a basic necessity of life, and people think that if you are in a difficult situation, then joy is to be thought about later, but we cannot live without joy, and heritage is a source of joy. And when I approached it from a development background, I came with the idea of that the incredible expertise that is in heritage is always communicated from north to south. Exactly as you said, Peter, people go in to teach people how to do things. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting if young people teach us about what is heritage for them from what they think is meaningful and worth capturing and taking forward. Exactly like you, when you said, this image is what you want to take forward, is what you want to preserve, these objects and their meanings for you. So the way we approach this is that we as in the young people in 3 different countries, in Egypt and Iraq and Syria, through local partners. We didn't do anything, it was the local partners that led this. Thought about how can young people capture all the old photos that are in senior citizens' homes. How can they capture the songs? How can they video the recipes as people do the recipes? How can they go out and capture all the different festivities, whether they are still going or not going? Because what we must remember is that long before people start targeting religious heritage sites in conflict situations, long before that, we know the signs through the assault on people's day-to-day heritage. It's when people stop eating together. It's when people can no longer have festivities that everybody joins in. It's when people can no longer wear their clothes because they'll be spat upon in church, in the street. These are the early warning signs that because we haven't taken heritage seriously, we lose out on. So when we started working with young people through their capturing of, they're interviewing senior citizens and young people, because heritage is dynamic. It's not just about the past, it's about the present and what you want to preserve in the present. Through videos and so forth. What we discovered, and this was something I never set out to do, it was I learned from them that the greatest single factor that will enable us to preserve our heritage for the future is young people mediating this heritage to the future generations. That they are able to see what is important for their meaning of community, collectively and individually, and they then communicate it in ways that make sense, that click to the younger generations. And through that work, they were able to disseminate to hundreds of thousands. In Iraq, whether we're working with the Yazidis, whether we're working with the Sabians, whether we're working with the Syriac Orthodox, whether we're working with the Chaldeans, whether we're working with the Kakayis, it's the young people within their own communities, have legitimacy in their own communities, that are able to do exactly what you did. Imagine a future that has what is meaningful. And exactly what you were saying about memory. Who is responsible for mediating memory and taking it forward? And I think that is the greatest assurance of something being preserved. But it is important because we were talking about freedom of religion or belief. And part of that is about community resilience through youth. But part of it is about that we are also preserving something for the rest of humanity. Because it's exactly as you were saying, that there's the memory of people joining in festivals across different faiths. And when you have that, then you can tell those that want to otherize everybody else, not so. There is a history in which people ate together. There's a history in which people took part in festivals together. There's a history in which people sang together. And you can tell them this idea of us and them, this idea of here and there. Well, there's a history that challenges the here and now that we can draw on.
And one of the very interesting things of your project and some of the other things we have done in the area of religious cultural heritage has raised the stakes, particularly in recognizing the challenges ahead of us. And one of the challenges is that there is an increasing number of sites which are packaged as religious heritage sites, usually funded by governments who would like to present themselves as religious freedom friendly and great patrons of cultural heritage, except that those sites usually represent heavily restored sites of communities which are no longer there. They have disappeared. So you've got governments who would like to package themselves as great protectors, great patrons of culture and cultural heritage. They repaint temples, churches, except that there are no working communities, living communities in those churches. They're not working temples. And religious communities have to ask for permission for governments to be there, to use those buildings. And this has raised another very important questions about how do we navigate this complex landscape of cultural heritage protection as such, the way we know it from the UNESCO mechanisms, the way we know it from other soft and hard law tools relating to cultural heritage, and how do we navigate this complex challenge between something which is a cultural heritage usually protected by the state, but it's also something which religious communities may wish and perhaps should be able to exercise their religious freedom to use them as working religious sites. And there have been a number of projects, particularly soft law tools, anything from the Universal Code for the protection of holy sites through the Knights of Malta Declaration for the protection of holy sites and places of worship in the Mediterranean, all the way to the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations Action Plan for the safeguarding of places of worship, which have in many ways tried in a fairly subversive and yet orderly way to address these blind spots. How do we negotiate this really difficult balance between cultural heritage sites, which have to be protected, where states have to exercise some kind of patronage on them, and the fact that there will be stakeholders who are likely to be religious communities, which also feel that they have patronage as well as stake in the unique use of those sites. And a lot of the soft law tools have attempted to bridge the gap. And one of the reasons we have invited at this panel the UN Under-Secretary General, Miguel Moratinos, is partly because he has been responsible, his department has been responsible for the drafting of the UN Action Plan on safeguarding of places of worship, but also because his political seat in Spain is the city of Cordoba, which has, among other things, one of the most iconic religious sites, which is the Cathedral Mosque of Cordoba. And it's one of the blueprints of a shared and, at the same time, contested religious sites. Miguel Moratinos, I could see the attraction, but also the challenges of the plan of action. That on the one hand, your unit has essentially taken the view that you wouldn't step into the territory of UNESCO.
No.
So you really try to capture the challenges which emerge in connection with places of worship, which are not necessarily considered and protected as UNESCO heritage sites. So do you think that the range and so to speak, the mandate of the plan of action had a wider range? Did it capture cultural sites as well as places of worship, or did you purposefully manage to stay out of the UNESCO range? Or did you feel that on occasions you actually had to overstep and say, well, there are certain things which we cannot separate so rigidly?
Well, thank you, Peter, and you are all invited to come to Cordoba. Go there. You will feel this sense of living together. We in Spain, we have one single word. English is good. We have to speak English, but Spanish language have succeeded to get in one word, living together, convivencia. That means that you can convivere with Jewish, with Christian, with Muslim, in a single city, in a single nation, in the whole world. So that is the main, let's say, mandate of United Nations Alliance of Civilization. I congratulate the organizer of this panel, because to talk about cultural and religious heritage and concern, it's not so often that happens. Let's be frank. We are much more, of course, concerned about the war, and due to the war, we are concerned about protecting cultural and religious heritage. But even without war, we should be concerned how to protect one of the fundamental rights of human beings, Article 18. It has been repeated yesterday many and hundred times, the right to express your belief, your freedom of conscience, your religion, your confession, your creed. And that is what really defines humanity. And my dear friend, we are losing humanity. We are losing the main sense of what we, Homo sapiens, go year after year, decade after decade, century after century, advancing to create a better world. So the main concern of United Nations Alliance of Civilization is to have the capacity to understand each other, even we have different culture, even we have different religion, even we have different civilization, even we have different identities, because everybody has one identity that can share with another identities, and we are very proud of our original identity, but putting every day, every year, every century, a new identity, in what is Miguel Moratinos. So, to go to your answer, well, UN family is a big family, no? But in all the family, you have a good relation, and of course, with Mrs. Audrey Azoulay is my great friend, so we have no problem to share the same concern about cultural, and they have been done a lot of very good work on the work of UNESCO, and what was the UN plan and the decision of Secretary General Antonio Guterres after the attack in March in 2019 of Christchurch in New Zealand. It was not during war. It was after synagogue had been attacked, after Catholic Church were attacked, after temple were attacked. That was not a conventional war. It were terrorists, people who consider that religious site was the perfect platform to expand their message of terror and destroying the sense of community, of one humanity that we want to build up. So Secretary General called me and said, enough is enough. Because why the attack of the religious heritage? It's not only to destroy the cultural heritage. I'm extremely touched by our Cypriot presentation and how much importance to present site and what means cultural heritage. And you have, my predecessor in the floor have extremely well developed the ideas. But at the end of the day, the terrorists want to really kill worshippers. And you can imagine what means that. That means that in any place you go to find yourself with yourself and your God or your spiritual message, you cannot be safe. You cannot be peaceful with yourself and with others. It's the end of humanity. So the problem is not only, of course, that we have to take measures, and I will go very quickly to express what we are trying to do, is that that is done between different confession or religion that consider that the other side has not the right to exist. And so they are going to attack synagogues because we have to really destroy the Jews. You know, the great Jews that they are manipulating the world, this conspiracy theory. Or they go and they say, well, this Catholic or this Christian, or the Muslim, Islamophobia. So the question that we have to really, in this 21st century, 2022 in London, is to start to think that we are one humanity, that all of us have come from a different culture and religion, but all of them have the right, the legitimate right to defend their belief, as we say, their religion and their culture as a one contribution to the better world. So if that is the plan, of course, I'm not taking care in particular about the protecting cultural religious site. I mean, there are so many. Notre Dame de Paris, of course. I mean, the UNESCO, that they say, or there is now in the Ukraine war. I mean, the UNESCO have provided a list of 7 sites that have been destroyed or attacked, etc. So we make a statement, we take action, etc. But my responsibility is to prevent, respond, and prepare to eliminate the attack in religious sites. Either they are a beautiful and cultural, historical legacy of humankind, or it's a minor city or church or synagogue or temple in the middle of nowhere. In Burkina Faso, when some people want to have mass and barbarians come and shoot all the people around. My responsibility to give each worshipper the right to go to pray and to be in peace with himself and with his God. Because spirituality has come back in the 21st century. Yesterday, Archbishop of Canterbury said 80% of humanity have a religion. You want to express their religion. 80% of humanity. That's the reason in the plan we have three main, and I will stop it. First, we want to have a mapping of the religious sites around the world. If I ask the audience, how many religious sites are in the world? 1 million? 200,000? 7 million? We don't know. It's not an easy task. I tried to convince member states. Reluctant. Security matters. You are going to satellite us. You are going to control us. So we start gradually. We have a pilot exercise. 5 countries to demonstrate where are the religious sites. If I have before a conflict, a war, where are the religious sites existing, I can, before they start bombing, to take the measure to avoid and to tell to the invader or the occupants, please, that areas are religious sites. So mapping, to give the sense of spirituality in the world. Secondly, and you mentioned about the youth, the creation of awareness of the importance of religious sites. So we have created a global campaign of communication of hashtag Save the Worship. We have reached around 10 million people around the world, young people. They're sending their videos, their program, their initiative to say that for them the religious site has something important. So I ask all of you to join this campaign. It's very important. And thirdly, it's much more complex, but it's part of the plan, is to have an international conference led by Secretary General in order that we establish the criteria and the elements in order to really preserve and protect religious sites. It's not normal that after what has been during centuries, every time there is a conflict, a crisis, a war, we have this situation that religious sites are bombed. Or we are not able to protect due to terrorism this part of the situation. So we are working with the Counterterrorism Directorate of the UN. Mr. Voronkov is the Director General. So they have a program about vulnerable targets. And of course, vulnerable targets are churches, synagogues, temples, mosques. So that is what we have to take into account. So just to end, to tell you that the problem is not between UNESCO or UNOSC or whoever. I think we have to take a collective, response. We have to create partnership, alliances with different parts, and an alliances between different culture and religion. In the prevention area, if there is an attack in a synagogue today or a Catholic church, immediately the other leaders, they will come the day after to show respect and sympathy and solidarity. But before the attack, do you have some common agenda to explain to the member of the community that is a religion that is called Islam, that is a religion that is called Catholicism or Christianity, that there is a religion? No. they are different. They are not like that, like us. We live a different world. And today we don't live in a different world. With all my respect, we are again, and I repeat again, one humanity that have to share together what is still the main element of Homo sapiens, that we know that we have a kind of sense of life, sense of the spirituality, and we want to really make a better world. So that is what is at stake today. And we don't understand that. Of course, we'll continue to have here and there some programs, some projects, but we'll not be able to really go to the root of causes and trying to make a better future for all of us.
And in a way, one of the interesting challenges and opportunities which the plan of action represents is really the realization that despite a fairly developed body of rules in international law which deal directly or indirectly with places of worship at a time of war or a time of peace, those rules have not proved to be particularly effective. Not because they don't have teeth, but because they are so broadly spread in the wide corpus of international law that sometimes policymakers or even international lawyers cannot really make sense of this major maze of rules, principles, mandates, which are not very easily to reconcile, connect, interconnect, using conjunction or using isolation. And the reason I have always been so sympathetic to some of the soft law projects which we discussed already, and that includes the plan of action of Alliance of Civilizations, is because sometimes soft law projects give simpler picture and a more working blueprint for policymakers on the ground to operate and to deal with issues which have to be resolved in this specific context rather than resolve as some kind of part of some kind of a grand narrative. And during these conversations, we came to the conclusion that in our attempt to have different meetings which map the three overarching themes of this ministerial conference, protect, prevent, and develop, we have failed because we have soon realized that we cannot separate this as three overarching themes that we have, at least as far as religious cultural heritage is concerned, linking it with freedom of religion or belief. You cannot protect without innovative, dynamic, preventative techniques and mechanisms, creating dialogical spaces at the different levels rather than simply top-down policy approaches, creating of opportunities of different parties to come together and understand that they have problem and try to resolve at least part of the problem and agree that in the future they have to continue resolving the unresolved issues. An approach very much borrowed from the great work our friend and colleague Malcolm Evans did in connection with torture prevention programs and approaches. And we have tried to apply it in relation to religious sites, religious cultural heritage. And finally, we came to pretty much obvious conclusion that we cannot have effective preventative techniques applied to religious cultural heritage without development approaches, borrowed from the rich arsenal of UN sustainable goals, engaging with angles relating to sustainable development in a G20 context and beyond, and really triangulating these different approaches and trying to make them see as interdependent rather than isolated. And our friend and colleague Peter Stone, the Blue Shield UNESCO chair from Newcastle, likes to use this triangle as a metaphor, but also a dynamic symbol, and usually argues that when he brings these different aspects of protect, prevent, and develop, that also creates dialogical spaces in the middle of the triangle to work out how to do those things, how to achieve the goals and the objectives we are trying to achieve. A task enormous, but nevertheless terribly important, but also a task which enables us to move from something which has been emerging in all the presentations today, and this is that a lot of the projects, a lot of the experiences, a lot of the cases we discussed, at least for an outsider like me, seem fairly reactive. So we do things because something has happened. We do not have the luxury and the opportunity to sit and be imaginative, be reflective rather than reactive, and really imagine why and how we should approach places of worship, religious cultural heritage, not as a response to a threat, not as a response as a challenge, but because they're gifts, and they're gifts in a number of ways. This also brings another question and a challenge to the panel, which is, if I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I have completely misunderstood the center of the conversation, but if we're really we have been reactive and we have essentially been saving the sunken ship of religious cultural heritage protection, what in our work, in our experiences, is there, what is missing, and what should we tell governments to do? Or how shall we help desk officers to do that job in terms of coming with good tactical but also strategic techniques and approaches to religious cultural heritage? Alberto Meloni.
Well, if there is a suggestion that I'd like to make is to not underestimate the cooperation concerning the preparation of experts for this type of protection. This cannot be done simply by goodwill or simply sending somebody for 3 days looking for a community to engage in something. In the case of the Syriac manuscripts I was mentioning, we asked to our government unsuccessfully to support the preparation of people capable to restore and preserve this manuscript on site. And I think that this could be extended to many other things. And if, mostly in the case of holy places that are hijacked, if we had the capability in the past to express and underline the value of what is at stake, this could have been a great resource. And so the issue of education, as usual in my view, means that there is somewhere the research preparing, education preparing the people. And so it's a complex mechanism that has to be asked to be implemented to the government, in my view.
To Sula, I'm sure that your recommendations will be very challenging, and we may not be able to meet your expectations, but no doubt we would love to hear how your journey has triggered a particular demand to governments and policymakers on the ground.
Well, listening to all of you, after 48 years and from Cyprus, in a country that is a member of the Commonwealth, a former colony of the United Kingdom, member of the EU, and so close to all of us, I would like to give you a challenge. I actually like to give you a challenge. I have a dream. I want to have my last pilgrimage before I die. I want to be able to go home to St. Barnabas Monastery, which is the first Christian church together with Antiochia worldwide, and pray in it, because that's where I was baptized. I can't. It's been turned to a museum. I want to be able to go to the church where my parents were christened and married, and where my grandparents were. I can't. It's been converted to a mosque. I want to go to Famagusta, the ghost city, where my town is and my church. I can't go there because there is a fence and it's been looted, destroyed, and there are no icons or frescoes for me to pray. And I ask you, United Nations, and forgive me because it's not you who decides, 20th of July last, Mr. Erdogan announced that he will come to Famagusta, my town, and he will pray in an illegally erected mosque. There was nobody there. I went there, shadowed by 2 journalists from Spiegel. He was praying remotely, and I couldn't pray on my church. And I kneeled in the street in front of my looted church, sir. And there was no UN soldier in the boxes next to it. And there was nobody to protect me. So just like I felt when I was 14, I'm 63 and I still feel the same. So in terms of legislation, I would like to make 3 points. What is the point of having on paper that the Foreign Secretary Trust described yesterday as the freedom to believe, to pray and commit acts of worship, if that freedom and related human rights are systematically violated by authoritarians and oppressors, as she called the perpetrators of such violations? Second, what is the point of having on paper international humanitarian law, the law of occupation and international criminal law, if these critically important areas of law are effectively rendered useless because of the selective delivery of international criminal justice? Thirdly, what is the point of having on paper the worthy statements published yesterday, including that on freedom of religion or belief in conflict or insecure context, if such statements are not accompanied with a concrete plan of actions which actively change the situation on the ground? And in this context, I must also ask the following question: why is Turkey not on the list of co-signatories? So I think impunity must end. We need universal respect for the rule of law and a uniform delivery of justice. And I end, therefore, by referring to a piece of advice given by St. Paul to the Corinthians. St. Paul told them, remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. And we have to start sowing generously for the human rights and religious freedoms of all. Thank you. I'm sorry for being emotional.
Thank you to Sula. Cole, you have done a lot of work in different capacities, and one of the most interesting things I've seen is through your involvement of the original advisory body to the ODIHR of the OSCE, and you did draft a number of toolkits for really approaching things like drafting legislation on religious associations, religious education, Toledo guidelines. I mean, is this the way forward? Is this what we need? Is this what we're missing? Do we need more top-level international instruments? Do you think we don't have enough clear and workable toolkits? I mean, if it was up to you to change the world tomorrow as far as religious cultural heritage is concerned, what would you do?
I think what I've thought a lot about is learning to focus on what is feasible. that is listening to people, listening to people's concerns, and focusing on areas where there are substantial opportunities. Sometimes we're so polarized in some areas that as much as we would like to respond, it's hard to move systems. But there may be things that can be done. And I think we need to, without abandoning the kind of concerns that you're talking about, watching for real places where there are easier opportunities. I know on the advisory panel for in the OSCE, one of the things we ended up focusing on was religious association laws. These are not dramatic, but they can generally be improved without triggering massive polarization. And that's an opportunity that we should do. Now, in the area of sacred sites, I think finding ways to focus on the most urgent things, which is part of what Miguel Moratinos is talking about, but also finding some ways to have dialogues in some of the really hard situations where you're talking about, and where if you listen to people and you listen to people on both sides, on all sides, you may find some ideas that are better than what any one side would have generated on its own. And listening for those better ideas, listening for ways that we can enhance dignity of people, that is what I think we should do.
Blen, you work on religious cultural heritage, which is in a war zone. We talk a lot about Ukraine. We often forget that there are wars going on in Yemen and Ethiopia, with plenty of cultural heritage being obliterated as we speak. What do you think would work and not work immediately if you have to save the day tomorrow?
I think if we're talking about the prevent part of protection, we have to think about from whom are we protecting these cultural heritage sites? Who are the instigators of either looting or destruction of cultural heritage sites? And when we think in those terms, at least in Ethiopia, we're thinking of neighbors, other villages, whatever. It's not necessarily some foreign actor coming in and doing all the destruction. So when we think of the cause or who the problem is, it's within our own societies. And how do we really how do we help each other understand the value of each other's religious heritage sites? It's really building both that interfaith relations and making that very tangible, and also really learning, really building those bridges. That is essential, if we're going to move forward. At the moment, I mean, it's very difficult I would definitely say that we need some sort of digitization. There are so many tools that we need to have on hand, because cultural heritage is being stolen. Much like the tablet is in Westminster Abbey, many things can go and then there's no way to trace them back, and we're going to be left in a similar situation that Tasula has been talking about. So we need to, and I think also there needs to be built awareness in Western countries as well, that these are not antiquities, these are valuable cultural heritage sites, these belong to people that still practice this faith, and there needs to be a genuine condemnation from that side as well. Why are these things being sold on eBay? Like lots of Ethiopian manuscripts have ended up on eBay, for instance, at the moment. So how do we stop that? How do we really speak and condemn such acts, such violent acts against a religion that's being practiced? So that's Jen, few points.
That's pretty good for next day delivery, and very ambitious, and also addressing some of the challenges Alberto raised. On the one hand, we want digitalization. On the other hand, we don't want digitalization to destroy the living libraries, depositories, and communities which thrive around them.
Could be a database. At the very least, it could be a database.
Yeah. And Maris, over to you. Your project has raised the same kind of challenges. How how can you use what you've already done tomorrow in 20 seconds to make sure that everything you have invested in this works, and that this intergenerational empowerment is not used politically or tactically by governments to show that everything is fine, but in fact nothing is fine in connection with religious cultural heritage?
I think the key is local ownership, and neither the Sustainable Development Frameworks nor the international frameworks make any sense to anyone working on a local community level, because they are very alien instruments. It doesn't mean that their intended outcome isn't positive. That may be, but they are alien instruments. And I think that we will need a total overhaul of how we think about development and how we think about heritage, because it is only when people locally own the knowledge, the vision, and the mechanisms to preserve their own heritage. And of course, that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for people to accompany them, to support them externally, but that's very different than to ask people to use instruments that don't make any sense to them to preserve something that they can preserve through support. But the whole mindset, the whole approach has to change. Otherwise, everything will be a waste of time, money, and effort. So there are ways, but we just have to change the mindset so that we can have something that is locally owned, locally led, and with support, international support. Of course, there needs to be partnerships and accompaniment, but the mindset, the approach has to change.
And finally, Under Secretary Moratinos, if you have a chance tomorrow and you're giving the options to really use the plan of action, let's say the plan of action, you could use a lot of other things as a way to really change things, change the world, would you do it through memoranda of understanding, understandings between states as a way of plugging it in as a very robust requirement that you cannot get investment, you cannot get trade agreement, you cannot get any security-related agreements unless you implement your plan of action? Or do you think that there will never be an appetite to implement the plan of action in such a robust and more aggressive way on the ground, because time is short?
Well, I think in international law, if you have the agreement of member state is the best guarantee. That's the reason we are calling for international conference, in order to avoid situation that has been described in this conversation. So we get some criteria how to protect religious sites, and all member states agree about this criteria, we will make the difference. But of course, we have not to wait for Godot to come. Negotiations are going to be difficult and long, so we have to act, in order that situation that can, be in the sense that will not protect safely the religious site, and that being used, manipulated, or, that's, I think, that make us as a UN to really take action, mobilize our initiative, and trying to solve the problem. Well, of course, I'm a representative of UN. We normally always blame UN. What we will do without UN? And what is UN? UN is member state. We own nation. So we are, each of us, we are UN. So the UN tried to make peace and security. Well, in case of Cyprus, I have to say to my dear friend that I'm thankful to have UN and Secretary General trying to find a final settlement. So, it's okay, you can blame UN. But at the end of the day, without UN, what we are going to lead the world? So we try to do, we have to get our self-criticism in order to improve our performance, our credibility. But at the end of the day, it's up to each of us to have a better UN. Because if member state doesn't agree, it's difficult that the system agree. So that's, I think, is what we are going to try to do.
Wonderful, and we could carry on for a good number of hours beyond our allocated time, but this conversation has to end now, but I hope it will only be a beautiful beginning of a beautiful friendships and continuous conversation with this fascinating panel. I've learned a lot from this talk, and we have tapped into new trajectories we haven't explored before. For those of you who are interested in this topic, stay tuned in the work we do, and look forward to seeing you on the roadmap of religious cultural heritage protection. Thank you very much.